People can come in when they come in. Super.
Yeah.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. And there'll be those who come to join us in just a moment. As some of you may know, my name is Roy Magara. I'm an employment law solicitor at Magara Law, and I've got a privilege today being joined by gracious Musariri, who I will let introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Gracious Musariri, and I am a registered mental health nurse by profession. I've been practicing as a nurse for over 7 years. I'm working for the NHS, specifically in acute adult wards and community mental health care. More recently, I've moved on to kind of a more operational role, looking at workforce development, still within the NHS. So we specifically look at how we can improve kind of the mental health workforce across the NHS, looking at their development and well-being as well. I've also founded Empylo this year. I'll call it my lockdown baby because it was an idea that came to me kind of through lockdown, and I just wanted to essentially improve mental health in the workplace, as it's an area that I'm very passionate about. And I've formed a community which anyone is able to join, sending out newsletters, engaging in webinars such as this, and also just running some focus groups as well to better understand what people's needs are in the workplace. So I'm really looking forward to this chat and to this talk today, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you kindly. So today, of course, we're looking at approaching mental health in the workplace. I know so many people seem to be talking about it at the moment, but it only drives home how important the discussion actually truly is. From an employment law point of view, I might be putting myself out of work, but you know what? In this remit, it's definitely worth it because there are so many claims that are up and coming, and it's all to do with mental health. It's all to do with stress, calls from the workplace. And when you really get down to the brunt of the matter, actually, if there was the right communication, if there was the right empathy, if there were the right procedures in place, so many of these claims could be avoided. Equally, we're getting a number of really interesting, really great inquiries from companies who are asking, actually, how can we do right by our employees? How can we get mental health right? How can we approach subjects like this with our employees properly? So that's what today's session is all about. We've got a case study which we're going to be looking at a little bit later on, but for now, just wanted to share some stats with people, and these are from a recent post-COVID study which showed these stats which are on the screen now. It'd be really helpful too, and you're welcome to message me privately if you'd want to. Let me know how you'd rate your own mental health. 1 being not where you want it to be, and 10 being great. Feel free to use the chat box. You can message me personally if you want to remain anonymous, or you're welcome to message it out into the group. But it will be really interesting to see where people place themselves. The reality is that COVID and life itself has affected us all. And we can see that mental health just doesn't involve the standard disabilities and conditions that everyone thinks about. It's also to do with your sleep, your appetite, your exercise, how you manage your day-to-day and those around you. But in particular, when we look at it in the workplace, it's how your work can be affected. There are a number of employees who are clients of mine who have said, I had a call this morning with a client who said she suffers from a particular disability, and if that's not managed properly, then that can affect her performance. Now, the issue with that is that the employer needs to have carried out various risk assessments and also ought to have carried out reasonable adjustments to ensure that she's able to get on with her job with as minimal amount of stress as possible. Unfortunately, instead of the employer making sure that there are these reasonable adjustments in place, instead of the employer making sure that these discussions are had, what the employer did is start disciplinary proceedings against her. Doesn't make a lot of sense there, really. And this is an employee who keeps on saying, my performance isn't where it ought to be. I'm late, I'm this, I'm that, and the other. I'm stressed because of things not being done by my employer. If only you changed A, B, and C, if only you can have an open and frank discussion with me, then I could be closer to that 10 score that that I asked everyone to kind of put into the group earlier, instead of something much less. The average at the moment seems to be, from people messaging in, seems to be around 6 or 5, and that's probably quite easily reflected. Somewhere at a 7, someone's mentioned 4, normally at 7. So it seems, at least for all of us, whatever the case may be, there is somewhere where we would all like to get to. Now, we're going to jump straight into the case study. I'm not going to read it out, but you can hopefully see it on the screen. And I'm going to pass over to Gracious in a moment, because Gracious is going to have some really helpful discussion points for us. And everyone, you're welcome, please, to use the chat to share your thoughts, to share your ideas, to put in your questions as and when you think of them. And we want to make this interactive as possible. So if you'd like to raise your hand in Zoom, if you want to unmute yourself and speak to. But for now, Gracious, over to you.
Thanks, Roy, and thanks everyone for sharing kind of your ratings for your mood today. It's really helpful to also understand and see where most people kind of land at. And just seeing that 4 today normally run at 7, it's also realizing that some days it could be external factors that will make us kind of run at a lower rate, and then other days it could be at a higher rate because of external and internal factors as well. So it's always good to kind of be aware and to always keep track of that. Okay, so going into the case study, as you can see here, this, just to add a bit of context, so this is a case study from when I was working as a nurse practitioner in the community. I was looking and supporting a patient who kind of brought this information to me. And the reason why it kind of stood out to me was just because essentially they weren't supported by the manager, and consequently actually led to them kind of deteriorating further in their mental well-being. And that just kind of highlighted again exactly how much of an impact the workplace can have on one's mental well-being, and how it's important for managers and employees to really understand mental health in order to better support one another. So firstly, as we said, we wanted to be quite interactive and engaging. So if you do have any comments, please do feel free to just put them in the comments box or to raise your hands. So the first question that I would like to ask everyone is, to, having read the case study, what do you believe kind of is wrong or could have been done better by the manager specifically? Or even if you feel that the employee may have approached it differently, please feel free to add your comments. I'll just go straight into, I think it's important to define what a reasonable adjustment is. So the definition for a reasonable adjustment is a change to remove or reduce the effects of a disability so that one can do their job. And this is essentially what this person was asking for. They knew that they'd been prescribed medication which made them drowsy. They were now finding it difficult to perform at work because they felt very drowsy throughout the day, and actually found it more difficult to sleep at night due to their anxiety and depression. They suffered from insomnia as well. So taking the medication in the morning made them more drowsy during the day. So they worked shift patterns, and their company could facilitate night shifts. However, when the employee approached the manager to say, actually, I think I'd be better off working at night because I struggle to sleep at night anyway, and I think I'll be more productive if I were to work at night, the manager kind of said, you're requesting too much. We can't facilitate that. Are you capable of doing your work or doing your job, essentially? So just to go back to what was wrong with the approach, I think the first thing for me is it may seem clearly the manager didn't make any attempt to make the reasonable adjustment, and worse off, they actually kind of accused someone of not being able to do their job just for asking and kind of opening up about their mental ill health. The manager obviously didn't show any support to the employee. They didn't seem to try and understand what was going on and what her needs were. And that's clearly not, to me, a sign of good leadership or effective leadership or compassionate leadership, to say the least. And that obviously resulted in employee feeling worse in their mental well-being and feeling kind of rejected to some degree. Another kind of point is I did consider whether the manager may have lacked awareness about mental health, and this could have been the reason for this response. which I think is quite common in the workplace, having kind of seen things more recently and engaged with people. Some managers genuinely don't know how to approach the conversation of mental health. And I think that's why Roy and I felt that it was necessary to have this discussion. So, and also it could be that the employee, she didn't have much of an understanding as well about what her rights were in accordance to the law, in accordance to making reasonable adjustments, because perhaps the employee could have said, this is actually statutory, you have to consider giving me this reasonable adjustment. So it's important for both people to kind of understand, both sides to understand the importance of how to approach mental health in the workplace. So just looking at perhaps how to approach your manager if you are an employee, I've just got a few points, which is firstly, I think it's important to kind of arrange a meeting or a discussion in order to have a conversation about your mental well-being, whether it's a one-to-one or a meeting, something that's, you know, a time that's, you know, given and set aside specifically for that conversation rather than just like a passing by chat. I think it's also important to try and be open and honest, even though I think most people, when they are in the workplace, they don't like to feel vulnerable. And there's, you know, so much evidence for that, you know, when we're in the workplace, we have to have this can-do attitude. We are being, you know, assessed for our performance. So we can't show what some people may see as weakness when it's actually not. It's actually strength to be able to be vulnerable and to express your needs. And to also come up with your own solutions, which I said, like in this case study, the person did come up with a solution and they did ask and request 4 night shifts. So they knew what would work for them. So I think it's important because although managers are trained to understand some needs and to make certain reasonable adjustments, they're not professionals in everything. So sometimes if you do have a solution and you know what will work best for you, it's important to essentially come up with those solutions and say, this is what I think will work. Can you facilitate or accommodate this? And also to get to know your organization's policies and to also try and get to know what the law around kind of disability is, because mental health is and does come underneath under the Equality Act, and there are laws to protect you as an employee. And then to flip it on the manager's side as to how, if you're a manager or a leader, how you would approach this kind of situation, or if a colleague coming up to you and saying, you know, I'm struggling with my mental health. I have an acronym because I do love acronyms, and it's LIVE, live. So the first word is listen, to listen actively. And active listening to me is generally showing interest and not just, you know, typing away while someone is talking to you, not writing notes all the time when someone is talking to you because you know that you need to record the conversation. Although it's important, I think it's actually sitting down and showing someone that you're listening. And one good technique, which is often used in by clinicians, is paraphrasing. So if someone is saying something to you, it's also good to paraphrase and to say, so what I'm hearing from you is XYZ, you are struggling with you're not sleeping very well, you're feeling drowsy. Paraphrasing is also very helpful because it allows you to clarify information and to make sure that you've got a really good understanding of what someone is expressing to you so that you don't get it wrong, or you try not to get it wrong. And then the next one is after L is I, which is interest. Show genuine interest in the person. And when I say interest, I mean holistically. So not just thinking about the workplace and not just thinking about how it's going to affect their job, but to show genuine interest in at home. Are you struggling at home as well? Because what goes on at home will certainly impact what goes on at work. So show interest in the person as a whole being rather than just what the matter at hand is or what the task they're doing or the project that they're working on or their job essentially. And then also V is validate. It's important to validate. Validation is not saying you've experienced it and you know what they're going through, but it's also showing appreciation for what someone may be going through. And techniques to validate is to essentially say, I can appreciate, or using terminology such as I can appreciate that this is what you're experiencing. Therefore, what about this solution? What do you feel about this? So I think validation is very key in allowing someone to feel heard and to feel that they're not being judged, and to feel that what they're feeling is okay, and that, you know, no one is judging them for example, in this case, someone was told that they weren't capable to do their job. That's definitely not validating somebody. That's actually quite the opposite. So, and it also helps you build a deeper relationship with your colleagues if you are a manager in the workplace, because people then feel comfortable to come and speak to you in the future if something is not right, whether it's related to their mental well-being or perhaps anything else within the workplace. And then the last word is E, which is enable. And I think this is really important because enable for me is, as a manager in the workplace or a leader in the workplace, you're not required to know everything, and you're not required to prescribe anything, in the sense of you can make suggestions if you think something would be helpful, but you're not a clinician. You wouldn't be expected to say, okay, you need to do this, you need to do that. So to me, enabling is essentially just giving someone that guidance or making it possible for someone to get to where they need to be. So if someone is asking for those reasonable adjustments, enabling someone would be trying to provide or to accommodate those adjustments in order for them to reach recovery. Enabling is also signposting, which I think as a leader in the workplace, it would be your responsibility to kind of understand what the resources are within the area. For example, if you know about Mind, or if you know about going to the GP, how going to the GP can help, making a list of, you know, services that employees can then look at and make their own choice, but you are enabling them by giving them these kind of contacts or where they can seek help and signposting them. And also just knowing that your part is to allow or encourage and enable someone to reach and achieve recovery. Although the responsibility for recovery may be the employee's responsibility, but you are also required to kind of enable that and, you know, help them in any way that you can. And then I'll offer some case studies towards the end of the session, but speaking from a kind of organizational perspective generally, let's just check the chat actually, because we did ask something. So Susan said another team here is 6 people. Ratings would be 4 of those people between 2 and 4, and bringing down the other 2 who I would have rated about 8. So I'm assuming this is to do with kind of your experience within your particular workplace and your team, and sort of how you support them. And then Andrea did say, I love acronyms too. And then I love the live acronym. Thank you, Andrea. And thank you, Susan, for your comment as well. Roy did say one thing I guess a lot is employees who say their manager employees have said that they think that mental health is a fad. That's a really interesting point. And I think it's sad really that, you know, this is what in this day and age, especially post-COVID, you know, or we're still in the pandemic, you know, during COVID-19, just seeing how much it impacted people's mental well-being, that people still don't have that much of an understanding. And it takes me back to that point of awareness. And I think companies have to do a lot more to raise awareness. And I'm going to come back to that point shortly, that if people do have that awareness, they can appreciate mental health and its impact a bit more, even for themselves. And then Joanne, her request doesn't sound unreasonable. If her manager had supported her, she may not have needed to be absent. Absolutely. And it's sad to, yeah, completely agree, Joanne. And it's sad to think that that actually impacted her even further because of her lack of validation and a negative response to her needs.
And the reality is, these points which you've kindly mentioned are so common and common sense, in that, as Joanne rightly mentioned, the request isn't an unreasonable one, and the manager could simply have supported her. Of course, from an employer's point of view, there are considerations that employers have to make too, in terms of whether they have the resource and whether they can move staff or shifts around. It isn't necessarily completely weighted in the employee's favor, as it were. But certainly the key word, as Gracious you rightly mentioned, is that reasonable adjustment. And quite evidently, the case study we have here, actually, which is very, very similar to a recent case that I had, and indeed it was found to be reasonable adjustment, is quite evident. One thing I want to touch on, please, Gracious, if I may. Well, first of all, just for those who may not have been able to make a note, on your acronym. Could you please just highlight what each letter means for everyone? Just one more
Yes,
time, please.
sure. So it's live. L is for listen or listen actively. I is for interest, meaning show interest and genuine interest in the person as a whole, or holistically. V is for validate, meaning offer validation when having these discussions. And then E is for engage. Enable, meaning enable, be a tool to enable one's recovery, not having to be the one that makes somebody recover or help someone to recover, but enabling that
That's
one to.
fantastic.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. Really good acronym, because I think I had an inquiry from someone earlier this week in terms of, okay, as a business, what do we do in terms of mental health for our employees and their well-being? Is there some kind of policy per se that we can put in place, or is there some sort of, what should we as employers do? What does the law say? And I think the reality, at least at the moment, is that there's no sort of law, if that makes sense, apart from, of course, employers need to show a duty of care. There's no sort of blanket rule in terms of this is what you have to do as an employer. But hopefully what people are realizing is that this webinar is showing that actually there are loads of practical ways that you can show your employees that actually well-being and mental health are important to you. Before I pass back to you, Gracious, I did want to pick up on one thing that Susan had mentioned in terms of the stats of her team. Susan, if you wouldn't mind just giving us a bit more detail and your thoughts, careful as they need to be, please, and as comfortable as you feel sharing.
Yeah, I do have to be careful because of the other people involved. But basically, I mean, we do have one lady that actually fits quite closely to this case study, which everybody's always been aware of. But then we had a major upheaval here that upset the whole of the team because of the behavior of one individual. And she was this was the person, like this case study was the person we expected to be in the worst place, but she actually wasn't. And other people just got more and more anxious and stressed by the changes that were having to go and worried about their own personal jobs and situations. Then, to make it worse, we've then had them trying to help each other, but not knowing what they're doing. So taking on each other's problems and in effect, doubling their own. So it's brought four of them down further than they already were. And now, because the terrible atmosphere they've got, it's bringing the other two down. So we're wanting to bring them all up, but we don't know how to bring them all up. I mean, to be honest, I've had to tell one of them he's very poorly. There's the physical health issue now as well coming in. And I've told him, you need to go to the doctor. Please stay at home next week, because I'm very worried that the stresses of here are going to make him even worse.
Thank you so much for sharing, Susan. Gracious, what sort of hints and tips do you have for Susan in this regard as a manager?
Yeah, I mean, it does sound quite like a very complex situation, as if kind of it's now being passed on from one colleague to the other, and it's becoming a whole team concern. What I would say is, I think you're right to suggest that what the individual that you've just kind of mentioned here does remain at home, or just take time out if it's certainly impacting their physical and their mental well-being. They should certainly take time out. And as a manager and a lead, I think you've made a good call for that. Identifying when someone needs to take time out and just relax and take a break. In terms of addressing the concern, that one issue is passing on to other team members, I would suggest individual discussions with each team member to really understand, again, engage using the live kind of acronym, really listening, understanding how their specific mental health is impacted and what it is that's exactly impacting their well-being. And then if all team members are amenable, then maybe have some kind of team discussion to really, in a meeting setting or a relaxed informal setting, for everyone to kind of understand what's going on and what's causing other people to feel distressed. and how you can all come up with solutions as a team to kind of improve everyone's well-being, essentially. So I think it's really important to involve all members of the team in the discussion at some point, but to also have separate discussions and essentially advising everyone of services that they can reach out to if they need support. Also the GP being a key contact. But yeah, I don't know, Susan, if you do have a list of kind of services that people can kind of reach out to, or that you can signpost people to, but it would also be really helpful to share that with people within a meeting setting or in a team setting.
Yeah, I mean, we do have an EAP that I keep on. I feel like I'm talking about it too much with them, to be honest, but because I don't think they're using it. And I also signed them all up to a resilience course, but I have a feeling that they haven't done that either, but I don't want to be interrogating them. So I'm giving them what I think and hoping that they take it. But I like what you've just said, Tuvi. It was nice to know that you felt like my one move was a correct move anyway. But yes, I take on board what you've just said.
Yeah, and I mean, with a resilience course, maybe, I don't know if it's an online course, but it would also be good.
Yeah.
What I do mention is bringing everyone together as a team so that a discussion can be started. So perhaps if you can bring in kind of an in-house course where everyone can engage in the course together, that can also start conversations which are meaningful, rather than people having to kind of sign up and do the courses themselves. Maybe people won't be motivated enough to do so. But then it also depends on, how people receive that. But I do wish you all the best with that, Susan.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks for sharing.
Really good points. Really good points that have been raised. And I think the reality is line managers, employers are human beings as well. And I think employees can sometimes fall into this trap of thinking nothing's wrong with my manager. Their life is perfect. It's my life which isn't perfect. But managers like you, Susan, and many others who are in this discussion today are all human beings too. And I think, Andrea, you raised another good point in terms of even the potential of bringing in a mental health first aider. One thing, of course, that an employer generally can do is indeed bring in that outside assistance. It shouldn't necessarily always have to be at the point when something's wrong and then you involve occupational health. There are plenty of preventative measures that employers can do. And I know with Empylo, that's an obvious line of attack there, really. Line managers need the knowledge and skills and resources to support others, help them not only return back to work in a sustainable way, but also to remain in work in a sustainable way, and therefore keep things like attrition and absenteeism down. And one thing that will be really helpful to do, that employers ought to do, in my view, is bring in, from a preventative point of view, someone, whether it's a mental health first aider to come in, or another medical practitioner with a view on mental health to help employees. And before I pass on to you, Gracious, in just a moment, one thing I've kind of caught myself on is we spend a lot of time talking about first aid training. Employers have a great focus on the physical needs of their employees, but we need to spend more time talking about the mental side of things, don't we?
Absolutely. And I think it brings me back to a common saying, which is kind of, I've heard quite commonly recently, is that, mental well-being is not a nice to have anymore, it's a must-have. In this kind of day and age, we're realizing statistics show us how much of an impact mental health is having on, 1 in 4 people are impacted. So taking that on board, there has to be some resources, which I think, like you said, Susan, there is an EAP. Most organizations do have EAPs, but I think what we tend to see is that employees don't engage in them. And another thing is also making employees aware of the services that are available and resources that are available to them. So yeah, I do agree as well about a mental health first aider within the workplace, training at least one person to kind of provide that support when people do need that support, but also bearing in mind that that person will also need supervision. If they are constantly supporting people and providing a first aid, they will also need supervision from somebody else to make sure that they're okay. and that they're coping well. So I think Andrea did say, and then training managers as mental health first aiders, providing managers with mental health training, also very important, as Rory, you've mentioned. So just moving on now, I think it's is pretty much linked to what we've just discussed here. Looking at the factors within an organization which can help to make mental health a better, a more comfortable discussion within the workplace. And one thing to start with is a culture. Thinking about the culture within the organization. Culture is at the center of an organization. It's at the center of, performance. It's at the center of well-being. It's at the center of pretty much everything. And the kind of culture that an organization has kind of determines how people enjoy being at work, how much people enjoy being at work, and even with the well-being side of things is how comfortable people feel about approaching their managers about mental well-being, and also how managers approach mental well-being when they are contacted by employees. So it's a powerful tool to encourage well-being, and it's about creating space, a space that is open, a culture that is compassionate. It's a culture where people feel comfortable to kind of discuss when something goes wrong or when something doesn't go the right way. They're not penalized for it. And this kind of comes from beyond well-being, but looking at even just common workplace practices, not kind of crucifying people if something goes wrong, but being able to deal with things in a kind of a compassionate way. And if you employ that kind of culture within your organization, generally people tend to feel more comfortable being vulnerable and talking and discussing mental health concerns. Practical examples of how you can improve culture. So peer support networks within the organization, whether it's a large organization or small organization, starting a network where people feel they can go and speak about things that are concerning them. Training, which we've already mentioned here, whether it's mental health first aid training, or if it's training about, training managers how to approach mental health in the workplace. Also training employees as well to understand how to identify when they need support for their mental well-being, when they need to approach their manager, and when they need to perhaps seek outside support from a GP. And also promoting awareness and using communication pathways, whether it's sending out emails regularly, which kind of have bite-sized information, sending out emails with, that can signpost people to services if they are struggling or finding it really difficult to cope at work, and just encouraging people and letting people know that mental health it's okay to talk about mental health in the workplace, and that they can approach, their managers if they are struggling, or they can approach other colleagues to talk about it. There is a good example of how culture actually changed mental well-being, and it's Thames Water. This was several years ago, back in 2012. Carl Simons, who's now OBE because of his work in improving mental health for Thames Water, he actually worked on changing and shifting the culture within what was an environment of kind of, mostly male workplace, which, mostly men didn't feel comfortable talking about kind of mental health or physical health really. And he tried to shift that culture by implementing some of those kind of practical steps, which I've shared with you, using communications to be able to kind of encourage conversations, having days where they specifically spoke about mental health and well-being, bringing in outside people to kind of have discussions about mental health. And ultimately that was, that had a major impact on the culture and subsequently the mental well-being of employees at Thames Water. And that's a really good example if you'd like to read into it. I'm also happy to share some of their work in an email after this as well. And then the next step would be leadership. Again, leaders in the workplace are influencers. If you are a manager, you're an influencer. If you are, whichever level of leadership you're at, you do have an influence on others. And as a leader, I think it's important to recognize your ability to influence within the workplace, and just leveraging on that within the workplace and the culture. So having an open kind of leadership style and a compassionate leadership style is really important. Being approachable, even sharing your own experiences and bringing up discussions about mental health in the workplace helps people to feel more comfortable to approach you as a leader. Again, I have a good example, a company in the US, which basically established a cohort of senior leaders, brought them together basically and conducted kind of a deep dive session where leaders actually spoke about kind of their own mental well-being experiences, whether it impacted them directly or if it's something that they were involved in terms of supporting somebody. And that actually had a major impact. That 68% of employees actually reported that they'd been able to then go on and speak to somebody about their mental health after kind of engaging in that deep dive session. And I know there are many companies nowadays where, using again communications, leaders kind of write a newsletter or a short story about their own experiences, or even just talking about what mental health means to them. You know, it doesn't have to be personalized in the sense of I've been through this or I've experienced this. It can also be, when I think about mental health, this is what I'm thinking, this is what I want this workplace to be like, and this is how we can work together. Just showing that you're open to that discussion really changes and influences others to do the same and to feel comfortable to talk about mental health in that particular workplace. And then as individuals as well, I think a lot of the time people feel, or more recently it feels that, you know, there's a lot of responsibility just being placed on managers and, you know, people who are in leadership positions. But it's also important to realize the importance of individual accountability. So what I like to say is that mental health is a shared responsibility when it comes to the workplace. So it's working together. And so if I'm struggling with something, or if I'm going through a mental health concern, I want to have that responsibility to speak to my manager about it. It's my responsibility to bring it up to my manager, because they're not mind readers. Of course, they can assess and see something's not right, but you also have to make that first step to seek that support from your manager. And then as a manager, you also have the responsibility to share, to, like I said, enable better health and recovery, and not prescribe anything, not be the solution, but to just enable that, whether it's signposting or saying what can we do to help you as a workplace, as well as the preventative side of things before someone is even experiencing a serious concern. It's that workplace manager responsibility to provide resources and to raise awareness for individuals. So looking at individuals, we shouldn't overlook the power and the influence that each employee has at any level of the workplace. And again, that's where mental health first aid training has been really helpful, because employees at any level can take on mental health first aid training just because of their interest. If someone has an interest in mental health, they can take on that training. And I would encourage employees at different levels to actually take that, rather than just saying it's managers who have to be mental health first aiders. I think it's important to have any employee, because some people would feel more comfortable approaching someone who they sit next to in the office, rather than someone who they have to, you know, set up a meeting and go and, you know, go through their line manager in order to see. So I think it's important to leverage on the power of each individual. Employees must also be educated again and informed about mental health, raising awareness again. Back to Roy, what Roy has said, awareness is the key to prevention. And if I know that, like we said, we started with the question, how would you rate your mental well-being today? It's about having an awareness. If I'm at, you know, at a 1 or 2, and I'm feeling really low constantly for, you know, several weeks, and I'm finding it difficult when I'm going into work, I have to be aware that something is not okay, and then I have to understand what's going on. So this is where awareness comes in, to be able to identify when something is not okay. What do I then need to do about it? So raising awareness within the workplace. As an employee, I think I've mentioned already, it's important for them to know their rights, how they can be protected, because I think most people just fear, you know, if I go and tell my manager something, for example, in the case study, will I be questioned whether I'm capable of doing my job? Will it impact me in terms of progression? And will it impact me in terms of, you know, keeping my job, essentially? And so letting employees know, or employees finding out what their rights are, and that it's okay to sometimes not be okay. Essentially, it's okay not to be okay, but then to also seek the support when you need it. and to also know where your organization stands when it comes to mental well-being. And then I take that responsibility back to leaders, because you have to have that information there for your employees to be able to read. So if it's simply writing a statement, or a policy on mental health, this is what we feel about mental health, this is how we can support you, we have an EAP, engage in this EAP, speak to your manager, just so that employees know where they stand, so that they're not fearful or afraid or confused about what to do in that situation. And the last point on, sorry, was someone jumping in?
No, I'm just agreeing. I'm agreeing, quite right.
Again, please feel free to add anything if anyone would like to jump in at any point. And then just the last point before I go on to the question that I see in the chat is, as an employer or employee or manager, it's essentially knowing your rights and to know that, it's a psychologically safe workplace. So managers have that responsibility, employees have that responsibility as individuals, to basically approach mental health and to discuss it and to know what to do in that case. So it's a shared responsibility, which I encourage more conversations to be had, even in informal settings or in a formal setting, such as meetings that are specifically talking about how can we be more psychologically safe as a workplace, how can we support each other in that sense when we observe a colleague finding it difficult, essentially, and having those what may sometimes seem like uncomfortable conversations, but they can lead to better outcomes, certainly. And then again, another example of how you can do that, again, informal or formal settings, a tech company in the US which conducted focus groups in order to understand the needs of their particular organization and the messaging that would be most effective within that particular organization. They ran these focus groups. They were able to pick out some themes just from having general conversations with the employees. They picked out those themes, they focused on the themes that they picked out, and then they developed a comm strategy. And then over a 6-week period, they rolled out this comm strategy, tackling each and every single one of those themes that they identified. And again, as a tax person, I think one key thing I would say is what they found out was people didn't like to use the word mental health within that particular organization. They preferred to use the word resilience. And again, it's understanding your colleagues and understanding your workplace. So they started using the word resilience more to replace mental health or mental well-being, which people received a lot better. So when people started approaching their manager, that say, I'm feeling less resilient today, I'm struggling with my resilience today, and that triggered that conversation, which was meaningful. So it doesn't always have to be, the same kind of standard approach for everybody. It's about knowing your organization. And again, those focus groups did wonders and actually had a major impact on that organization. They then did a post-campaign survey, which revealed that the company or the campaign had positive impacts and positive results. And most people, 10% of employees employees felt that they'd improved, or their symptoms had improved by 10% just because of that 6-week rollout campaign, and that they felt more comfortable to then discuss mental health with the colleagues and with their managers, just because those themes were addressed and those issues were addressed. And then that's it from me at the moment. And I can look at some of the questions here. And we've got a question from Roy. Compared to pre-COVID times, do people think people's mental health is generally better or worse off? That's an interesting question. If anyone has any comment, please feel free to just jump in.
Yeah, quite right. We had a couple of mixed answers so far. Susan, you mentioned definitely worse, and Andrea said a bit of mix of both. And she used the key phrase you brought up there a moment ago, Gracious, in terms of resilience there. But I think quite rightly so, I was going to touch on the point of connections and people we know and the network around us that we can helpfully and hopefully support each other in. Really good points there. A couple more points to really kind of substantiate all those really good points you're making there, Gracious, on resilience or mental health and how we can help each other. From a manager's point of view, again, this is a very practical discussion we're having in terms of what you can do. And the reality is things have indeed changed post COVID wise, because we're not all heading toward a workplace or a premises. Some of us have mixed ways of working, and some of us work from home, and indeed some of us are back on premises. Some things for managers, or things that managers you can feed back to your powers that be, is that, or indeed employers work best when they have a committed and engaged manager. And really that acronym, I think, is going to be the star of the webinar, really, in terms of how useful that can be, that live, listen, show your interest, validate, and enable. And I think it's also honoring the fact that all of us work differently. Some people want more of a collaborative way of working, or more assistance, than others who prefer to work autonomously. The reality is, the way we work ought not to be a sort of one-size-fits-all technique. It's about seeing how we can complement each other and our strengths, and areas where we can all need that sort of improvement, and build each other up in that respect. And the rest of the examples there speak for themselves, really. But I think that the last point is probably something to touch on in terms of a desired frequency of contact with their boss. When we talk about mental health, sometimes the immediate reaction can be, okay, let's just put in something every day, have a morning meeting, and then we'll ask people how they're doing, and before we all kind of get on with it. But actually, some employees might not necessarily want or need that. Some might need more than that, of course, and some may be happy with less. But as long as that employee knows that there is no hurdle to jump over by the time they need to get to their manager to have that discussion. And managers, this is to you too, managers will have managers. And you'll have your network there too. So as long as you know that there is someone whom you can turn to with the right frequency, with a purposeful meeting or something in the diary set for that kind of discussion, that in my view is something that really, really helps. And lastly, before we open up the floor to anyone for your own comments, your own thoughts, your own questions that you might have too, or indeed for us just to continue the discussion, is just on some lessons to take away from this, in terms of some, again, practical things that employers can do. Yes, by all means, you can have your policies or things in black and white in place there. But actually, in terms of your day-to-day, if you've got employees who you know have got disabilities or conditions which may affect their work, or if you look at someone's form and you can see that they may not necessarily have talked about openly with their line manager, or discussed a condition with their line manager, and you think actually this person's put dyslexia there, or ADD, or whatever the case may be, but it doesn't look like any reasonable adjustments are in place, actually take the first step forward. It's going to be quite unlikely that an employee is going to think you have some kind of ulterior motive if you're coming open-armed and ready to have a discussion about how you can help that employee. Next, there are so many employers out there who are just so fixated on targets that their employees and their well-being goes out the window. And it's a shame, really, because the reality is there are still so many high levels of attrition linked to the fact that employers were so focused on targets not being met, as opposed to the why those targets aren't being met, as to why that particular employee may be absent more than usual, or why that employee's mood may be lower than usual. So it's about there being clarity in terms of the conversations that are had between managers and their employees on expectations, being flexible, and acknowledging that actually in life, as a number of us have mentioned, there are ups and there are downs, and a lot of those things can be down to external factors too. Lastly, empathy and kindness doesn't cost anything, and it certainly isn't a sign of weakness. And I think that's something which we can all take away from this discussion as well. So Gracious, I don't know whether there's anything you wanted to add in terms of some lessons to take away with this before we open up to everyone.
No, I think you've covered it really well. Thank you for that. Really helpful points.
Super. Well, actually, I think now is actually a really good point. People, you're welcome to raise your hand if you want to say something, and we'll come to you, or put something in the chat. But before doing that, Gracious, perhaps you could explain a little bit more in terms of what Empylo does and the value you can bring to companies in this sort of context.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, Empylo, we have two elements. One element is the community, where we just kind of support people, whether employees or managers, anyone interested in mental well-being in the workplace, can join the community for kind of monthly newsletters, sometimes we run focus groups as well to better understand what the common issues in the workplace are and how we can bring solutions for that. We also do offer in-house consultations, supporting and developing a well-being strategy for workplaces that are kind of bespoke and specific to their kind of company and organization, and also delivering some training for employees as well as for managers, because awareness is key, as we've kind of touched on throughout this session. It's preventative and it kind of engages people at the point where they need to be engaged rather than when it's too late. So that's essentially Empylo in a nutshell. Thanks, Rory.
Yeah, not at all. So if anyone needs any business needs Empylo in their lives in terms of mental health training, etc., or that communities you mentioned, Gracious details are on the screen in terms of getting in touch with someone from Empylo, and no doubt you'll be able to pick that up and you'll be happy to help. One question that's come in privately, and I think there's probably one more for you, Gracious, given the topic. Are there any common differences between men and women when it comes to mental health or talking about mental health?
In terms of, that's a really good question. In terms of mental health itself, we do see that men are actually more likely to be impacted by kind of serious mental health in the sense of severe depression, and this is usually middle-aged men, so men I think above the age of 35 and up to maybe 59, 60, yet they do find it more difficult to talk about mental health and to kind of address mental health. This is the same at home as well as within the workplace, and they're more likely to take extreme measures when they're finding it difficult to kind of open up, as opposed to women who tend to be more open to discussing mental health with their friends, even with colleagues as well. In terms of within the workplace specifically, for women and men, I don't know of any specific kind of statistical differences in terms of approaching managers or approaching their workplace about mental health, but women are more likely to experience anxiety and depression. But then again, that has to be taken with caution, because again, we know that men are less likely to report anxiety or depression. Therefore, it's really difficult to kind of base anything on statistics. But yeah, generally, there is a difference. But the conversation for men, it's more important, I think. Well, not more important, but it's more difficult to address mental health needs with men. Generally, this is what we see, even in clinical practice. When we tend to have male patients, it's usually when they're a lot more serious and they've kind of gotten to the point where they need severe intervention, whereas women are more likely to speak to their GP earlier on in their journey of mental ill health. So in terms of, again, supporting men and women and being specific within your organization, understanding, having that conversation, and the example that I gave earlier from the tech company, they ran those focus groups or those discussions to really understand what was best received by their employees, and they again realized that the word resilience was better received within their company. So if you have a majority male company, or even just whatever it may be, understanding what words or wording or how people view mental health and what the common themes are can also help to better be able to address and support employees. So yeah.
Thank you very much. Has anyone else got a question or a comment or otherwise before I touch on one other thing? No, doesn't look like it. So I'll jump into the next question. Oh, sorry, do go ahead.
Hi, sorry this might have been covered in any way, shape or form, but I think what's really important to mention in this whole conversation around mental health and what employers should do to help employees. I mean, just a comment, if you will, really, or, great to have your thoughts, Gracious and Roy, on this. But I just find like mental health, improving mental health in the workplace has been a long-standing topic. I really do. I've attended, not just because I'm attending this webinar, but just generally, in whether it's in the media or just generally on LinkedIn, I've noticed there's lots on removing the stigma around mental health what employers should do, you know, the practical tools. There's been a lot of conversation around a lot of this, and I'm finding it very interesting hearing today again about the way how employers are still having to implement these basic steps despite all of the talk that's been going on around improving mental health and managing mental health in the workplace. So in short, my kind of comment or question, if you will, is why are we still having this conversation in light of the awareness that's been raised around mental health, making improvements in mental health? Because it feels like we're almost going around in circles here. What, you know, if you will, maybe what are the main barriers? Why are we still having this conversation? How much, you know, how long will it go on for? You know, maybe has the COVID situation helped so that maybe instead of having those same conversations, we're more just, okay, what next? You know, but it still feels we haven't quite jumped off that first rung of the ladder, if you will.
Really good points. Gracious, would you like to go first or shall I?
Yeah, please go first, Roy. It's fine.
Thank you. I suppose as long as there's litigation going around, there evidently is a need for businesses to get things right. In the main, I wouldn't suggest that there is a sort of callous precedent behind employers. And by that, I mean, I don't think employers intend to cause their employees to have poor mental health or what have you. But I think that, and indeed, it has, in my view, gotten worse with COVID. I think part of the difficulty is where employers ought to prioritize things like mental health and well-being of their staff, other things take over: workload pressures, targets, incoming revenue, profits. And yes, these things ought not to supersede the importance of a human being with mental health. But I think in reality, that does happen. And so instead of there being discussions being had with employers, what happens is that gets pushed aside. And then the reality of a high workload or other stresses going on in an individual's life, that equals poor mental health. Hence, we end up having a discussion like this, which hopefully is really practical for people. I haven't spent much time going on about cases or the law or what have you. We really want to give people practical tips so that we can hopefully have this discussion less, because things like mental health are improving. But I think the reality is that there are those who still think mental health is a fad. There are those who don't prioritize mental health as they ought to. And there are indeed those who want to make mental health a priority and are listening to discussions like this. So there will probably always be a need, given our human nature, is my point of view. But hopefully it's going to be more of a positive discussion than a negative one. What do you think, Gracious?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you, Roy. But I would just add that I think there is progression. It's very slow, but there is some progress in terms of kind of addressing or at least acknowledging the need for mental health in the workplace over the years. I think the main major point or the turning point was around 2017 when the government actually commissioned an independent review into organizations' mental well-being and how organizations are, or what organizations are doing to address or approach mental well-being. And that was the Thriving at Work report, which was commissioned by the government. And they made some recommendations. I think not much has been done in terms of responding to the recommendations, but one of the recommendations was that every company, you know, within a specific time period, I don't know exactly when, would have to have some form of strategy and resources within the workplace that employees should be aware of and that employees should be able to engage in, whether it's a small business or a large business. So I think from the government's perspective, especially post-COVID, there's more kind of going on in the background from a government perspective. You know, there's the Department of Health, they're currently updating their mental well-being at work guidelines, NICE guidelines, which would companies would have to kind of use when kind of approaching mental health in the workplace. And I know there's also the Occupational Health Society or Occupational Health I guess reviewers. They've also implemented a new guidance as well on psychological safety. It's ISO 43. I don't know specifically, but I can always share that in an email afterwards, which is a standard which also has to be employed by companies. So in terms of the government backing, there's a lot more going on. And I think that is largely to do with COVID, as well as also just before COVID, there was a lot more kind of awareness being raised by organizations. Deloitte is another company to also look into, and they've done a lot of work in raising awareness of the importance of mental health in the organization, and actually doing things rather than just talking about it. So I can always kind of share some of those examples in an email afterwards, which I'm sure Roy will be happy to share with everybody. But yeah, I do agree with you, Laura, that there is a way to go, and it sometimes feels quite tedious, and that we're having these conversations. People are posting things on LinkedIn, and people want to talk about these things, but you don't see any actual results. But there is still a long way to go. But I think hopefully with government backing, and again, people having access to social media and people being more open to discussing it on platforms like LinkedIn, we get to see more results in the years to come.
Yeah, I agree. I'm conscious of time in terms of wrapping up, but there was one other question which came in privately to me, which hopefully we can answer very quickly in about 30 seconds or so. And that question is, I have a manager who is unlikely to be empathetic. What do I do? And well, I suppose from a legal point of view, on the assumption you talk about being unempathetic on the subject of your mental health and or your well-being, certainly in terms of escalating it, you're welcome to cite in a formal grievance and escalate it there in terms of legal advice if you feel the need to. But in terms of trying to deal with it as practically as possible, at this particular moment in time, Gracious, have you got any thoughts in terms of what this person can do?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say to go back to the point you made earlier about kind of arranging that discussion and having that conversation, and trying to convey what you're experiencing. If you feel it's necessary to also have spoken to your GP, if you feel that maybe something more tangible would help them to kind of understand the conversation and understand your needs better, having had a discussion with your GP first, understanding what it is specifically you need, and then approaching them. If they are unempathetic, which, like we said, they can be. Some people can be unempathetic. It's important, like Roy said, to follow a grievance process, because it's important that your needs are met. So yeah, that's the only advice I can offer at this point.
Super. Thank you very much, Gracious. And thanks to you all for your time today. It's been really great to have the discussion and to have all of your input. Really grateful for that. Hope you got a lot from today's session. Our details are on the screen if you want to continue the discussion with us, or engage in Empylo or me or otherwise. But otherwise, for now, it's goodbye from Gracious.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I've really enjoyed this discussion, and thank you for sharing as well. Take care.
And it's goodbye from me. Thank you very much, and goodbye. Super. I think you can stop recording now as well if you haven't already.